My name is Daniel Reeves. I am 44 years old. I wake up at 5 in the morning not because an alarm tells me to, but because my brain does not know how to stay still once it starts moving. I make 1 cup of coffee, I sit at my desk, I open my laptop, and I think about problems until I find solutions that nobody else saw coming. That habit, the one where I sit alone and think until I find the thing hiding inside the problem, that habit is the reason I am telling you this story today. It is also the reason my former boss, a man named Richard Colton, spent 6 months believing he had won something that was never actually his to take. Let me be completely straight with you right now before we go anywhere else. I am not a dramatic person. I do not enjoy conflict. I do not go looking for fights. For most of my life, I was the person in the background, the one who solved the hard problems quietly while someone else took the stage. I was comfortable back there. I thought that was just who I was. It took getting fired on a Thursday afternoon with 0 pay, 0 notice, and a laugh that I can still hear clearly if I close my eyes. It took all of that to show me that being comfortable in the background was not humility. It was fear. And fear was the only thing standing between me and everything I had spent 12 years building toward. Here is what happened. I worked for a company called Apex Solutions Group in Austin, Texas. We built enterprise software, the kind that large companies use to manage their internal operations. Inventory systems, supply chain automation, workflow management. Not the flashy consumer apps that teenagers downloaded by the millions. The serious, invisible, load-bearing kind of software that ran the back end of industries most people never thought about. I had been there for 7 years. In those 7 years, I had built 3 of the company's 5 core products from scratch, not contributed to, built, from the first line of code to the finished product that clients paid real money to use every day. I was the lead architect on every major technical decision the company had made since 2017. My fingerprints were on everything that worked. My name was on nothing that got rewarded. That was the arrangement. That was the deal I had made without fully realizing I was making it. I built. Richard sold. Richard presented. Richard shook the hands in the meetings I was not invited to. Richard got the bonuses and the press coverage and the speaking invitations at industry conferences. I got a salary that was good by most standards and completely inadequate by any honest measure of what I was actually producing. I told myself it was fine. It was not fine. The day everything changed started the same way all my days started. Early, quiet, coffee, laptop, problem. The problem that particular morning was the biggest one I had ever worked on. 18 months of work. The thing I had been building in the spaces between everything else. The idea that had come to me at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in February 2022, and that I had been developing piece by piece ever since. I had called it Flowline internally, just to myself. Nobody at Apex knew the full scope of it yet. I had been building it carefully, methodically, making sure every piece worked before I showed anyone anything, because this was not a normal product update. This was a completely new way of thinking about how enterprise software connected to itself. I will explain what it actually was in the first point, because you need to understand it properly to understand why what Richard did was not just wrong. It was catastrophic for him in a very specific and very technical way. I brought the full pitch to Richard on a Wednesday morning in March. I had a working prototype. I had a slide deck. I had 3 months of stress test data showing the system performing at a level that existing solutions in the market could not come close to matching. I sat across from Richard in his glass office, and I walked him through all of it. He asked sharp questions. He always asked sharp questions. That was genuinely what he was good at, understanding quickly whether something had market value. I answered every question. I showed him the data. I showed him the prototype running in real time. He leaned back in his chair when I finished. He said, "Daniel, this is the most significant thing we have ever built." I said, "Yes." He said, "I need 2 weeks to think about how we position this." I said, "Okay, but I want to be part of that process. This is my work, and I want to be at the table when we decide how it goes to market." He looked at me. He said, "Of course, we do this together." That was a Wednesday. On Thursday afternoon, his assistant called me into the conference room. Richard was not alone. There was an HR person I had met once. There was a legal document on the table. Richard looked at me the way a person looked at something they were done with. He said, "We are making some structural changes. Your role is being eliminated effective immediately. There is a severance package, but given the circumstances, we are going to need you to sign the NDA before any payment is processed. Legal will walk you through it." I looked at the document. I looked at Richard. I said, "Richard, what is happening right now?" He said, "It is a business decision, Daniel, nothing personal." I said, "You saw the flowline pitch yesterday." He said nothing. I said, "You are eliminating my role the day after I showed you the most valuable thing this company has ever seen." He stood up. He said, "You are a good engineer, Daniel, but engineers are replaceable. Ideas belong to the company once they are developed on company time with company resources. That is what your contract says." I said, "I built Flowlane on my own time, on my own equipment." He almost smiled. He said, "That is going to be very difficult to prove." He walked to the door, he opened it, he looked back at me. He said, "You are a nobody, Daniel. You always were. You just did not know it yet." Then he left. I sat in that conference room alone with the HR person and the legal document and the specific silence of a moment that had just broken something and was waiting to see what would come out of the break. I did not sign the document. I picked up my bag. I said, "Tell Richard I will be in touch through my own attorney." I walked out. I drove home. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. I started working. 24 hours later, Richard Colton's lead investors pulled $50 million from Apex Solutions Group. His stock dropped 40% before the market closed. His board called an emergency session. 3 enterprise clients put their contracts on hold. And then his number appeared on my phone. I want you to stay with me through this entire story, because what I did in those 24 hours and what I did in the months after is something I need to explain properly. Not for drama, because the details matter. Because the details are what turned a Thursday afternoon firing into the beginning of the most important chapter of my professional life. Hit that like button right now before you forget. It takes 1 second and it means I can keep making these stories. Subscribe if you are new here. I am putting out something new every week and I do not waste your time with filler. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Now let me take you back to the very beginning. Because to understand what Flowline actually was and why Richard could not take it the way he thought he could, you need to understand where I came from and what 12 years of building software in other people's names actually looked like from the inside. I grew up in a working-class part of Nashville, Tennessee, the second of 3 kids in a house where money was always the background noise of every conversation. Not in a dramatic way, in the quiet, constant way of a family where the adults were always doing the math in their heads and the kids learned to read that math without being taught how. My father drove a delivery truck for 22 years. Same route, same company, same clock in and clock out that structured our entire household around his schedule. He was not unhappy with his work. He was a practical man who had made a practical choice and who executed that choice with the kind of steady reliability that I came to understand much later was itself a form of excellence. He showed up. He delivered. He came home. My mother worked part-time as a medical receptionist and managed our household with a precision that I now recognize as a genuine operational skill. She knew where every dollar was, where it was going, and what it was for. She never wrote a budget on paper because she did not need to. It lived in her head the way a map lived in the head of someone who had walked the same streets for 20 years. What I got from the two of them was not money or connections or a network that would open doors for me later. What I got was a framework. Show up, be precise, do the work completely. Do not cut corners in the places that matter, even when cutting corners would be easier and nobody would notice immediately. I noticed immediately when corners were cut. Always. That specific sensitivity to the gap between how something was supposed to work and how it actually worked. That was the thing I had before I knew what to do with it. I got interested in computers through the back door, not through gaming or design or any of the entry points that most people associated with kids who eventually built software. I got interested through watching things break and trying to understand why. Our family had one desktop computer from around 2001. It was the family computer, shared, technically under the authority of our parents, practically used by whoever needed it most urgently. I used it for homework. I also used it because I was fascinated by the specific way it sometimes stopped working correctly. Not fascinated in a frustrated way, fascinated in a genuine, curious way. When the system slowed down or programs crashed or the internet connection dropped at unpredictable intervals, I wanted to understand the mechanism behind the malfunction, not just fix it, understand why it broke, what the chain of events was that produced the outcome, where in the sequence the thing had gone wrong. I started reading about it, not from textbooks, from forums and user groups and the specific early internet communities where people who actually built and maintained systems talked to each other in plain language about real problems. By the time I was 15, I was fixing neighbors' computers on weekends for $20 a session, not because $20 was significant money, because fixing things for real users with real problems was a different kind of education from anything I was getting in school. The problems were specific. The solutions had to actually work. There was no partial credit for a computer that was 70% fixed. I went to the University of Tennessee on partial scholarship and paid the rest through a combination of campus tech support work and freelance projects that I picked up through a growing network of small business clients in Knoxville who needed someone reliable and affordable. Computer science degree, graduated in 2003, not at the top of my class, not because I was not capable of being at the top, because I was spending a significant portion of my energy on work that was paying my tuition, and that was, honestly, teaching me more practical skills than most of my coursework. My first real job was at a small software firm in Nashville called Bridger Systems. 8 people, one conference room that doubled as a break room, a product that managed scheduling and payroll for mid-size manufacturing companies. Not glamorous, not funded by venture capital. A real business with real clients and real pressure to deliver working software on time. I was there for 4 years. In those 4 years, I went from junior developer to lead engineer not because I campaigned for it or asked for it, but because the people above me kept leaving for larger companies and I kept staying and the work kept getting done correctly under my hands. That is how I got my first leadership experience, not through ambition, but through presence and reliability and the specific willingness to take responsibility for the quality of the output. I learned something critical at Bridger that shaped everything I did afterward. I learned that the most valuable thing in software was not the code itself. The code was the expression of the idea. What was valuable was the architecture. The decisions made before a single line of code was written about how the system would be structured, how the different parts would talk to each other, how it would scale when more users came, how it would fail gracefully when something went wrong, how it would be maintained by people who had not built it originally. Architecture was invisible to almost everyone. Clients did not see it. Managers did not see it. Even most developers did not think about it carefully until the system they had built started showing its structural problems years later. The specific slow collapse of something that had been built on a foundation that nobody had properly thought through. I saw it from the beginning, every time. I moved to Austin in 2007 for a senior role at a mid-size enterprise software company that was growing fast and needed someone who could handle the technical complexity that growth was producing. I spent 3 years there building out a back-end infrastructure that more than doubled the system's capacity, and cut the client-facing error rate by 68%. I did not get a bonus for that. I got a thank you email from the CTO and a modest salary increase. I mention this not as a complaint, as context. The pattern was already established before I ever walked through the door at Apex Solutions Group in 2016. I built things. Other people benefited from the things I built in ways that were disproportionate to my own compensation and recognition. I accepted this arrangement not because I thought it was fair, but because I was genuinely more interested in the technical problem than in the politics of who got credit for solving it. That was my mistake, and it took Richard Colton making it catastrophically obvious to show me clearly enough that I finally acted on what I had always actually known. Richard recruited me to Apex with a pitch that was more compelling than any I had received before. He told me he was building the company that would become the operating layer for the next generation of enterprise software. He told me he needed the best technical mind he could find and that he was prepared to create an environment where serious technical work could happen at the highest level. He was persuasive. He had a genuine gift for communicating vision. He could take a complex technical concept and translate it into language that a board of investors or a room of clients could immediately understand and get excited about. That was a real skill, and I respected it genuinely. What he could not do, what I came to understand completely over 7 years, was build the thing he was so good at selling. That was where I came in. And for 7 years, I told myself that was a partnership, that the builder and the seller needed each other equally, that what I brought and what he brought were complementary, and that the company we were making together was the evidence of that complementarity. I was right about the complementarity. I was wrong about the partnership. Because a real partnership requires that both people acknowledge what the other one actually contributes. Richard acknowledged my contributions privately in the moments when something I had built worked perfectly and a client was happy and the numbers moved in the right direction. He never acknowledged them publicly. Not once in 7 years did he stand in front of an investor or a client or a conference room full of people and say, "The person who actually built this is Daniel Reeves." I let that go every single time. I should not have. Now let me tell you about Flowline, because this is the part that everything else depended on, and I want you to understand it properly. The problem that Flowline was designed to solve was one I had been watching build for years inside every enterprise software environment I had ever worked in. Large companies used many different software systems, systems for HR, systems for finance, systems for supply chain, systems for customer management, systems for compliance and reporting. Each of these systems was typically built by a different company using different underlying technology and different data structures. They had been bought at different times, often before the company had a clear overall technology strategy, and integrating them so they could share information correctly and in real time was one of the most expensive and time-consuming problems in enterprise technology. The existing solutions to this problem were what the industry called middleware software that sat between different systems and translated information from one format to another so the systems could communicate. The problem with existing middleware solutions was that they were rigid. They were built around predetermined connection types, and when the systems they were connecting changed, through updates, through new features, through shifts in how the company used them, the middleware broke or required expensive manual reconfiguration. Every large company I knew of had at least one engineer whose entire job was essentially maintaining the duct tape that held their middleware integrations together. Flowline was a completely different approach. Instead of building fixed connections between systems, Flowline used a self-learning mapping layer that continuously monitored how data actually moved through a company's systems in practice and built its own connection logic based on that real behavior. When a system changed, Flowline detected the change, analyzed the impact on the existing connections, and reconfigured itself automatically within minutes. It was the difference between building a bridge and building a river. The bridge was fixed. If the banks shifted, the bridge broke. The river found its own path based on the actual landscape. I had the core concept in February 2022. I spent 18 months building it on my own time, on my own equipment, in the early mornings before work and on weekends, and in the evenings after my regular work was done. I kept meticulous records of every session. Every file had a timestamp. Every commit to my personal code repository was dated and logged. My personal laptop, which I had purchased myself and had never connected to Apex's network, contained every line of code. I knew from the moment I had the idea that this was not something I was going to hand over to Apex without understanding exactly what I was handing over and what I was getting in return. I had watched Richard present other people's work as his own too many times to be naive about what happened to things that went through his hands. What I did not fully anticipate was how quickly he would move or how thoroughly he believed he had covered his tracks. The morning after my pitch, he called an emergency meeting with his head of product and his head of engineering. I know this because the head of engineering, a man named Victor Park, who had more integrity than most of the people in that building, texted me that evening and said, "Daniel, something is happening that you should know about." I called him. He told me that Richard had called them in and presented Flowline as a company initiative that the engineering team was going to be tasked with developing. He had not mentioned my name once. He had described it as an idea that had emerged from ongoing internal research and that he personally had been shepherding. Victor said, "I didn't know what to do. I wanted to push back, but I didn't have enough information and I didn't want to make it worse for you." I told him he had done the right thing by calling me. I thanked him. I said, "Victor, do not do anything yet. Just make sure you remember everything you heard in that room." He said, "I took notes." I said, "Keep them somewhere safe." Then I called my personal attorney, not a corporate lawyer, a technology intellectual property attorney named Susan Marsh, who I had been introduced to through a friend 2 years earlier, and whose number I had saved in my phone for a reason I had never fully articulated to myself until that moment. Susan picked up on the third ring. I said, "Susan, I think I need you." She said, "Tell me everything." I talked for 45 minutes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Daniel, how thoroughly documented is your independent development of this system?" I said, "Completely. Every session, every file, every commit. Personal device, never connected to their network, timestamps going back 18 months. She said, "And the pitch you gave him, was anyone else present?" I said, "Just Richard and me." She said, "Okay, here is what is going to happen tomorrow. You are going to go into that office. You are going to act completely normal. You are going to do your regular work, and you are going to wait." I said, "Wait for what?" She said, "For him to make his next move, because whatever he does next is going to tell us exactly what we are dealing with." She was right. His next move came the following afternoon. And it changed everything. Hit that like button and keep watching, because the next point is where the firing actually happened, and where I made the decision that most people in my position would never have made. The conference room where Richard fired me was the same one we used for client presentations. I want you to picture it because the specific physical details of that room matter to me in a way that I have thought about many times since. Long rectangular table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted screen on the far end, floor-to-ceiling windows on the right side that looked out onto the street below. It was a nice room, intentionally nice, designed to communicate a certain version of the company to the people who sat in it. I had sat in that room probably 200 times over 7 years. I had never sat in it the way I sat in it that Thursday afternoon. The HR person was a woman named Carol who I had interacted with maybe 5 times in 7 years. She had a folder in front of her and a specific professional neutrality on her face that I recognized as the expression of someone who was doing a job they had been asked to do and who was not personally invested in the outcome. Richard was standing when I came in. He sat when I sat. That detail, him standing first and then sitting, told me he had rehearsed this. He had thought about the staging. The legal document on the table was a combined separation agreement and NDA. Standard format with specific non-standard additions that I could see from 2 feet away were designed to cover Flowline without namming it directly. Language about intellectual property developed during employment, about systems and concepts related to company business areas, about the definition of company resources, including time and mental effort. Mental effort. They were trying to claim that because I had thought about the problem of enterprise software integration while I was employed by a company that made enterprise software, any solution I had developed was theirs regardless of where or when I had actually built it. It was a stretch, a significant stretch, but it was written by a good lawyer and it would have created serious problems if I had signed it. I did not sign it. I read it at the table while Richard sat across from me doing the specific thing that people did when they were waiting for you to finish reading something they did not want to discuss in detail, looking slightly to the side, checking his phone twice, adjusting his cuffs. I put the document down. I said, "Richard, I am not signing this." He looked at me directly for the first time since I had walked in. He said, "Daniel, I want to be straightforward with you. The company has the right to the work you did here. That includes work you may have done adjacent to your employment. The legal team is very confident about this position." I said the work I developed for Flowline was done on my own time, on my own device, with zero company resources. I have 18 months of documentation proving that. Your legal team is going to have a very difficult time in front of a judge. He did not respond to that. Instead, he said something that told me he had already moved past the negotiation phase and into a different mode. He said, "You have always been a good engineer, Daniel, but engineers are commodities. What you built, the concept, the market opportunity, that is what matters. And we have the resources to take it to market in a way that you never could alone." I said, "So you are going to take my work and build it without me?" He said, "I am going to take a concept that exists inside a company I run and develop it with a team that is capable of executing at scale. That is just business." I said, "Richard, I want to ask you one question." He waited. I said, "Do you actually understand how Flowline works? Technically, not the pitch, the actual mechanism." He said, "I understand enough." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "You don't, and that is going to be the specific reason this does not go the way you think it will." He stood up. He said, "The offer is on the table. The NDA needs to be signed by end of business Friday or we proceed without it. Either way, today is your last day." He walked to the door. He held it open. He said the thing about me being a nobody. I will not give that sentence more space in this story than it deserves. It was designed to shrink me. It did not shrink me. It clarified something. The specific clarity that comes when a situation removes every ambiguous element and shows you exactly where you stand and exactly what you need to do. I walked out of the building. I sat in my car for 3 minutes. I called Susan. I said he fired me. No pay, NDA on the table. They are claiming Flowline as company property. Susan said, "Did you sign anything?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "Good, come to my office in 1 hour." I drove to Susan's office. We spent 2 hours going through every piece of documentation I had, every timestamp, every commit log, every file creation date on my personal device. Susan had a technical consultant she worked with regularly who joined by phone, a man named Tom who specialized in digital forensics for intellectual property cases and who spent 40 minutes asking me extremely specific questions about my development process and the technical architecture of the system. Tom said, "This documentation is as clean as I have ever seen. If this goes to court, the timeline is airtight." Susan said, "Okay, Daniel, I need you to understand something clearly. You have a very strong legal position, but legal positions take time and money to enforce, and Richard knows that. He is betting that the resources required to fight him will be enough to stop you. I said, what if I do not fight him? Susan looked at me. I said, what if instead of fighting him legally, I just go ahead and launch it myself? Now, before he has time to build anything. She said, you have a working prototype. I said, I have a fully working prototype that I stress tested for 3 months. It is not a demo, it is a real working system. She said, how long to get it to a state where you could put it in front of serious buyers? I said, I need to set up the business infrastructure, legal entity, commercial agreements, hosting, the software is ready. Tom said from the phone, I can have a technical certification of independent development ready in 48 hours. Signed, documented, admissible. Susan said, I can have the IP registration filed by close of business tomorrow. I said, then let's do that. I went home. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. I started working. Not on the software, on everything around the software. The thing that Richard had never understood about what I had built was that Flowline was not just a clever piece of technology. It was a solution to a problem that every enterprise client of a certain size had been paying to manage badly for 20 years. The market for it was not theoretical. It was specific, and it was enormous, and I knew exactly who the buyers were because I had been sitting in rooms with them for 7 years, watching them describe this exact problem in their own words. I worked through the night, not in the romantic movie version of working through the night where a single person changes everything by dawn. In the real version, methodical, focused, one task at a time, moving through a list that I had written in order of priority and that I was executing against without distraction. By 4 in the morning, I had a business entity filed in Texas, Flowline Technologies, LLC. By 6, I had a commercial hosting environment configured on infrastructure I had built specifically for this purpose, using cloud services that I had been paying for out of my own pocket for the past 4 months in preparation for exactly this moment. Yes, 4 months in advance. I had known this day was coming, not the specific form of it, not the Thursday afternoon conference room with Carol and the NDA on the table. But I had known that the moment I showed Richard what Flowline actually was, the situation was going to change irreversibly one way or another. I had been preparing for both outcomes. At 8 in the morning, I sent 3 emails. The first email went to Victor Park. It explained what had happened, what I had documented, and what I was launching. I told him I was not asking him to do anything. I was informing him as a courtesy because he had treated me with integrity. The second email went to a man named James Okafor. James was the Chief Technology Officer of a manufacturing conglomerate called Trident Industrial Group, one of the largest of its kind in the American Southeast, who I had met at an industry conference in 2021 and with whom I had maintained a professional relationship. He had told me twice in that relationship that the single biggest operational pain point his company had was the cost and fragility of their system integration infrastructure. I sent him a 3-paragraph email describing Flowline in plain language, telling him it was now available as an independent product, and asking if he had 45 minutes to see a live demonstration. He replied in 11 minutes. He said, I have been waiting for someone to solve this problem for 15 years. When can you show me? I said, this afternoon. The third email went to a woman named Patricia Holt. Patricia was a partner at a venture capital firm called Meridian Growth Capital that focused specifically on enterprise technology. I had been introduced to her through a mutual contact 18 months earlier and had had 2 exploratory conversations with her about the enterprise software space in general. She knew my work at Apex without knowing the specific details of what I had been building independently. I sent her a technical summary of Flowline with a 1-page market analysis and a single sentence at the bottom. I am launching this independently today. If you want to be part of it, call me before noon." She called at 11:47. While I was on that call with Patricia, something was happening at Apex Solutions Group that I was not aware of yet, but that I would understand completely by the end of the day. Richard Colton had spent Thursday night, after firing me in a series of meetings with his engineering team, trying to understand what they needed to do to build Flowline themselves. His head of engineering was Victor Park. Victor sat in those meetings and listened to Richard describe the architecture of a system that Richard had seen pitched exactly once by the person who had built it. He described it wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. The core innovation of Flowline, the self-learning mapping layer, the part that made it actually work differently from every existing solution. Richard had not understood it well enough to describe it accurately. He described a more conventional system with some AI features bolted on. Competent engineers could build that. It would take a year, and it would not do what the real Flowline did. Victor knew this. Victor also knew, because I had told him, that what Richard was describing as a company initiative was my independent work, with 18 months of documentation behind it. Victor did something that I had not asked him to do, and that I did not know about until afterward. He forwarded the technical summary I had sent him to two of Apex's lead investors. Two investors who had been funding Apex for 6 years. Two investors who had a combined stake of $50 million in a company whose most significant new product, as it turned out, did not actually belong to the company. By 3 in the afternoon on Friday, I had a meeting confirmed with James Okafor for the following Monday. I had a follow-up call with Patricia Holt scheduled for Saturday morning. And I had a text from a number I did not recognize that said, "This is Marcus Webb, Apex investor. I'd like to speak with you urgently about the Flowline situation. Are you available today?" I was available. That conversation lasted 2 hours. By the time it ended, I understood exactly why Richard was about to call me. He called at 6:47 that evening. I watched his name on the screen for 4 full rings. Then I answered. Subscribe right now and hit the like button, because the next point is the phone call, what he said, what I said, and the specific moment where I understood that the rest of this story was going to go in a direction nobody at Apex had planned for. Richard's voice, when I answered, was different from the voice in the conference room the day before. The conference room voice had been controlled and slightly cold, the voice of a man performing authority he considered unquestionable. The voice on the phone was controlled in a different way, tight, the way a voice got tight when the person using it was managing something internal that they did not want to be audible. He said, "Daniel, I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday." I said nothing, I waited. He said, "I want to talk about Flowline, about how we move forward in a way that works for both of us." I said, "Okay, talk." He said, "I may have moved too fast on the restructuring. I want to explore whether there is a path where you come back to Apex and we develop Flowline together properly, with your name on it, with compensation that reflects your contribution." I listened to this. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because the honest answer is complicated. There was a part of me, the part that had worked inside Apex for 7 years and that knew the company's clients and infrastructure and market position. There was a part of me that understood the logic of what he was offering. Apex had distribution. Apex had relationships. Apex had a sales team and a support infrastructure and credibility in the market. Going it alone meant building all of that from zero. The part of me that had spent 7 years being comfortable in the background said, maybe this is the practical choice. Maybe this is how it actually works. Then I remembered the conference room. I remembered him standing at the door. I remembered the word nobody. Not because I needed to be angry to make a good decision, but because the anger cut through something important. It cut through the familiar pattern of accepting less than what I had actually earned, because accepting less felt safer than claiming what was mine. I said, "Richard, I want to ask you something directly." He said, "Go ahead." I said, "When you told your engineering team about Flowline yesterday, how did you describe the core architecture?" Silence. I said, "Specifically the mapping layer, the self-learning component. How did you explain how that works?" Maury silence. I said, "Because if you cannot describe it accurately, you cannot build it. And if you cannot build it, then what you are actually offering me is the chance to come back and build my own product inside your company under your name for a salary, which is exactly what I have been doing for 7 years." He said, "Daniel, I have the resources to." I said, "Richard, I had a call this afternoon with Marcus Webb." Complete silence. I said, "And with Patricia Holt at Meridian." The silence changed quality. I said, "And on Monday I am meeting with James Okafor at Trident Industrial to do a live demonstration of a fully working system." He said, "Daniel, think about what you are doing. We have lawyers, we have the contract language. We can make this very difficult for you." I said, "You can try. My attorney filed the IP registration this morning. I have 18 months of timestamped documentation of independent development. I have a technical certification from a digital forensics expert. And I have 2 of your investors who are currently reconsidering their relationship with Apex based on information they received today about the circumstances surrounding Flowline's development." The silence that followed was the longest one in the conversation. I want to describe it carefully because it is the silence that meant everything. It was not the silence of someone thinking about what to say next. It was the silence of someone who had built a position on an assumption, the assumption that I would not fight, that I did not have the resources to fight, that I was too conditioned to the background to step into the front, and who is now processing the specific sound of that assumption collapsing. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I do not want anything from you, Richard. I want to build my company. I want to bring Flowline to the market that needs it. I want to hire good people and pay them properly and put their names on the things they build." He said, "And Apex?" I said, "Apex is your problem. It has always been your problem. I built the solutions. The problems were always yours." He said, "Daniel." I said, "I wish you well, Richard. I genuinely do. 7 years is a long time, and there were real things built in that time that I am proud of. But I am not coming back, and I am not going to be a nobody." I ended the call. I sat at my desk. Duke, my dog, came and put his head on my knee the way he did when he could feel the energy in the room change. I put my hand on his head. I said out loud to nobody, "Okay, let's build something." The next morning I called Patricia Holt back and we talked for 2 hours about what Flowline was, what the market opportunity was, and what I needed to scale it into a real company. She asked the best technical questions I had ever been asked by someone from the investment side. She understood the problem that Flowline was solving not just conceptually, but mechanically. At the end of the call, she said, "Daniel, I want to bring this to our partners. I think we can move quickly on this if the Monday meeting with Trident goes the way I think it will." It went better than she thought it would. But that is the next point. Hit the like button, subscribe, drop me a comment, and tell me if you have ever had to say no to something that seemed like the practical choice, because the practical choice was actually just the comfortable one. I want to hear it. The Trident Industrial Group had its regional headquarters in a 12-story building in downtown Houston. I drove there on a Monday morning in a car that had 140,000 miles on it and a coffee stain on the passenger seat from a spill I had not gotten around to cleaning up. I am telling you that detail because I want you to understand the specific distance between where I was standing on that Monday morning and where I needed to get to. I had a working product. I had an attorney. I had a promising conversation with an investor. I had 0 clients, 0 revenue, 0 employees, and a company that was 4 days old. James Okafor met me in the lobby himself. He was 51 years old, 6'2", and had the specific physical presence of a man who had been making serious decisions for 30 years and who was comfortable with the weight of them. He shook my hand, and he looked at me with the direct assessment of someone who was going to make up his mind quickly and did not need a lot of theater to do it. He said, "I watched your demo video twice last night." I said, "I hope the second watch was better than the first." He almost smiled. He said, "Let's go upstairs." The meeting room on the 10th floor had 8 people in it when we arrived. His CTO, his head of operations, his VP of enterprise systems, 2 senior engineers, a legal representative, and 1 person I did not expect, the CFO, a woman named Sandra Merritt, who had the specific quiet attention of someone who was calculating something in the background of every conversation she was in. I set up my demonstration. I want to explain what I showed them, because the technical detail matters to understand what happened next. Trident ran 11 different software systems across their manufacturing, logistics, finance, HR, and compliance operations. They had been spending approximately $3.4 million a year on what James called integration maintenance, keeping all 11 systems talking to each other well enough to function. 3 full-time engineers whose entire job was managing those connections. Constant breakdowns when vendors updated their systems. Data inconsistencies that produced errors in reporting that required manual correction. I connected Flowline to a test environment they had prepared, 3 of their systems running in a sandboxed version that their engineers had set up for the demonstration. I showed Flowline doing in real time what I had spent 18 months building it to do. It analyzed the data structures of the 3 systems, built its own mapping logic, and created stable connections that updated automatically when I made a deliberate change to one of the system configurations. The test their engineers had prepared for me involved a specific type of configuration change that they knew from experience typically broke their existing middleware and required 6 to 12 hours of manual reconfiguration. Flowline detected it, adapted, and was stable again in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The room was quiet when I stopped the demonstration. James looked at his CTO. The CTO looked at me. He said, "How does the mapping layer handle schema changes that involve new data types that the system has not seen before?" It was a good question, a genuinely good technical question from someone who understood the problem deeply. I spent 20 minutes answering it, in detail, in the specific technical language of someone who had built the thing from the ground up and who understood every piece of it completely. Not a pitch, a real technical conversation about how the system actually worked and what its current limitations were and what the development roadmap looked like for addressing those limitations. That conversation, the honest one about what the system could not yet do as much as what it could, was what changed the meeting. Sandra Merritt, the CFO, who had been quiet for the first 90 minutes, spoke for the first time. She said, "What is your commercial structure?" I said, "Annual subscription based on the number of system connections managed, plus an implementation fee for the initial setup and calibration period." She said, "And support?" I said, "Included, directly from me initially, as the company scales a dedicated support team." She said, "What is your pricing for an organization our size?" I gave her the number. She wrote it on her notepad. She looked at James. James looked at me. He said, "Daniel, I want to be direct with you. I have been looking for this solution for a long time. I have evaluated 4 different products in the last 3 years, and none of them did what you just showed me. The question I need answered before we go further is simple. Why did you leave Apex?" I told him the truth, the complete truth. The pitch, the firing, the NDA I did not sign, the documentation, the IP filing. I told it the same way I had told everything in that room, without drama, with the specific directness of someone who was not interested in managing the narrative. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at Sandra. She said, "We will want to see the IP documentation before we sign anything." I said, I will have Susan Marsh, my attorney, send everything to your legal team today. James said, if the documentation checks out, I want to move to a contract discussion this week. We shook hands. I drove back to Austin. I called Susan from the car. I said, they want to see the IP docs. She said, already sent. I sent them this morning before your meeting. I said, Susan. She said, I know how you work, Daniel. I just do the same thing. Patricia Holt called at 4 in the afternoon. She said, Marcus Webb at Apex reached out to me today. He wants to talk about what Apex's exposure looks like if you pursue the IP claim. I said, what did you tell him? She said, I told him I was focused on my own investments and he should talk to his own lawyers. I said, Patricia. She said, I also told him that the documentation I had reviewed was extremely compelling and that I expected the market to have a clear picture of who actually built Flowline very shortly. I said, was that the right thing to say? She said, it was the true thing. The right thing and the true thing are usually the same thing in my experience. She was right about that. The Trident contract came through on the following Wednesday, a 12-month initial agreement with options to expand to all 11 systems if the first phase performed as demonstrated. The contract value was $420,000. I sat at my desk and looked at the number for a long time. Not because the number itself was life-changing, because the number had my company name on it. Flowline Technologies LLC, built by Daniel Reeves, owned by Daniel Reeves, delivering value to a client who had found it because of what it actually was and not because of who was presenting it. I called my mother that evening. She said, Daniel, how are things? I said, Mom, I got my first client today. She said, your own client, not your company's. I said, my own client, my own company, my own product. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I always knew. I said, I know you did. She said, does this mean you are going to stop calling me at such odd hours? I laughed. She laughed. I said, probably not. She said, good. Hit that like button and subscribe. The next point is where the money actually arrived and where Richard made one final move that I had to deal with in a way that settled everything permanently. Patricia Holt brought Flowline Technologies to her partners at Meridian Growth Capital 6 weeks after the Trident contract was signed. I want to tell you about that meeting because it was the most important meeting of my professional life, and because the specific way it went says something true about what happens when you build something real and put it in front of people who know the difference between real and performed. There were 5 partners in the room. Patricia had briefed them on the background, the Apex situation, the IP documentation, the Trident contract, the technical architecture. They had done their own independent review of the documentation and had brought in their own technical consultant to assess the Flowline system. Their technical consultant's report described Flowline as, and I am quoting directly from the written summary they shared with me, a genuinely novel approach to enterprise system integration that represents a meaningful advance over existing solutions in both adaptability and maintenance cost reduction. The meeting lasted 3 hours. They asked hard questions, real questions, about the technical development roadmap, about the competitive landscape and how I expected it to respond once Flowline gained market visibility, about my plan for building a team that could support the product's growth without losing the architectural coherence that made it work, about the Apex situation and its potential legal implications. I answered every question with the same complete honesty I had brought to every conversation since the Thursday I was fired. At the end of 3 hours, the senior partner, a man named Arthur Cole, who had been in enterprise technology investment for 25 years, said, Daniel, I have one final question. I said, go ahead. He said, why are you the right person to lead this company not build the product, lead the company. Those are different things. I said, you are right that they are different things, and I want to be honest with you about that difference. I am the world's leading expert on what Flowline is and what it can be. I'm not the world's leading expert on scaling a software company. What I am is the person who understands this product completely, who has spent 7 years in rooms with the exact clients who need it, and who has demonstrated in the past 6 weeks that I can close a contract and deliver on it without anyone else carrying the process. I know what I do not know. I am going to hire for what I do not know. And I am going to be the best possible version of what only I can be, which is the person who actually built this and who will never stop understanding it at the deepest level. Arthur Cole looked at his partners. He looked at me. He said, "When can you start the paperwork?" Meridian Growth Capital led a seed round of $6.2 million. 3 other investors joined the round after Patricia made introductions. The total seed raise was $8.8 million. I sat in Susan's office when the wire cleared, and I read the account balance twice because my brain did not entirely trust it the first time. $8.8 million to build the company that Richard Colton had tried to take from me in a conference room 5 weeks earlier. I went home. I took Duke for a longer walk than usual. I thought about my father driving his truck for 22 years. I thought about my mother's household math. I thought about the Bridger Systems conference room that doubled as a break room. I thought about 7 years of fingerprints on products that had other people's names on them. I thought, this one has mine. Now, Richard. I want to be clear that what happened with Richard was not something I engineered. I did not spend energy trying to cause his professional situation to deteriorate. I was too busy building my own company to spend time on his. But consequences have their own momentum, and they do not require your active participation to arrive. 3 weeks after the Meridian round closed, Richard Colton filed a lawsuit against Flowline Technologies, alleging misappropriation of trade secrets and breach of the NDA that I had never signed. I read the filing with Susan. It was aggressively written, the kind of legal document that communicated that the person filing it had not fully adjusted to the specific reality of their situation and was still operating on the assumption that aggression alone would carry the day. Susan said, "This is actually good news." I said, "Explain that to me." She said, "He filed, which means we get discovery, which means every communication Richard had internally about Flowline, every email, every message, every meeting note, becomes accessible to us. He just opened the door to the evidence that shows his timeline." The discovery process took 4 months. What it revealed was this. In the 48 hours between my pitch and my firing, Richard had sent 11 internal communications describing Flowline and plans for its development. None of those communications referenced me as the developer. All of them described the concept as an internal company initiative. Several of them discussed how to handle the fact that I was, and I am quoting from an email to his head of legal, probably going to be a problem. The phrase was underlined in the printed discovery document that Susan put in front of me. Probably going to be a problem. I looked at that phrase for a long moment. I thought he knew. He knew from the first moment what he was doing. He did not accidentally fail to mention my name. He deliberately removed it. He sat in his glass office and made a calculated decision to take my work and use the machinery of the company I had built for him to do it. That was the finding that ended the lawsuit. Before the case went to trial, Richard's attorneys contacted Susan with a settlement offer. The number they offered was significant. Susan advised me to counter. We countered. They came back. 3 rounds of negotiation over 6 weeks. The final settlement included a complete acknowledgement that Flowline was my independent development. A formal legal statement that Apex had no claim to the product or its derivatives. A payment that I will not disclose specifically, but that covered every legal cost with a meaningful amount remaining, and a permanent injunction preventing Apex from developing any product that incorporated Flowline's core architecture without a licensing agreement from Flowline Technologies. Richard signed it on a Tuesday morning. I was not in the room. I was in a meeting with 2 potential enterprise clients in Dallas. Susan texted me, "It's done." I texted back, "Okay, call you tonight." I went back into the meeting. That evening, I took Duke for a walk along the trail near my house. It was October. The weather in Austin in October was the kind of weather that made you understand why people moved there, warm enough to be outside comfortably, cool enough that the air actually felt like air rather than heat. I thought about Richard. I want to tell you something honest about this because I think it matters. I do not hate him. Not because I am a saint, because hating someone takes energy and energy is a resource, and I have a company to build. More than that, I have spent my professional life trying to understand problems clearly, and the honest understanding of Richard Colton is that he was a man who was very good at one thing, and who let that one thing convince him he was entitled to everything around it. That is not a uniquely evil trait. It is a common human failure in people who achieve a certain level of success. He was wrong about what he tried to do. He paid for being wrong. That is the complete moral accounting of it as far as I am concerned. What I think about most is not Richard. What I think about is Victor Park. Victor left Apex 6 months after the settlement. He came to me directly and asked if there was a role for him at Flowline. I said yes before he finished asking the question. He is now my head of engineering. He is excellent at his job. His name is on everything he builds. Flowline Technologies today has 23 employees. We have 11 enterprise clients, including Trident. Our annual recurring revenue passed $4 million last quarter. We have a product roadmap that will take us 5 years to execute, and that I am more excited about technically today than I was when I first had the idea in February 2022. I still wake up at 5 in the morning. I still make 1 cup of coffee. I still sit at my desk and open my laptop and think about problems until I find solutions that nobody else saw coming. The difference is that when I find them now, the name on the work is mine. I want to say one thing before you go. When Richard called me a nobody in that doorway, I felt it land. I want to be honest about that. It landed, not because I believed it, because it articulated the specific fear that I had been carrying quietly for 7 years without naming it. The fear that the background was where I belonged, that the building was what I did, and the recognition was what happened to other people. That fear was not the truth. The truth was that I had been choosing the background, not because it was the right place for me, because it was the safe place, because stepping out of it meant claiming something, claiming that what I built had real value, that my name belonged on it, that I deserved to stand in the front of the room and say this is mine and I made it. Richard did not make me brave by firing me. I was already capable of being brave. He just made it impossible to keep choosing safety. If you are watching this and you are building something in the background of someone else's success, if your fingerprints are on something that has someone else's name on it, I am not telling you to blow everything up tomorrow. I am telling you to be honest with yourself about what the arrangement is and whether it reflects what your work is actually worth. Then make the decision that the work deserves. That is what I did. Hit the like button if this story meant something to you. It genuinely helps me get these stories in front of more people, and that is the whole point. Subscribe. I put out a new story every week, and I am not going to waste your time. Drop a comment below. Tell me if you have ever been called a nobody by someone who needed you to believe it. Tell me what you did with that. I read every single comment, every one.